Good evening, everybody. This is Cinnamon Noir.
And this is the Ramen Shaman.
Welcome back to Epistory.
The forest seemed to exhale as she left. Its scent sweeter now than they had ever been.
So,
Was it
go ahead.
relieved to see her go?
Yes, that's the reason. The forest secretly hates her. One thing you may have noticed from last episode is that I actually zoomed out the camera properly for this one, and you can see the score ranking on the bottom. So, apologies to everyone who watched the first video, but we're not going to do it again.
Including me?
No, I don't need to apologize to you.
I see.
Be grateful,
I see how it
Greg.
is.
You get to watch this whole
put up with
amazing
my
game. And anyway. Actually, Greg.
I was going to say be grateful for you putting up with me being a lazy bastard. Okay, that works.
Greg, I didn't need to apologize to you because you don't watch our videos. So you're not an audience member. Statistically speaking, I'm pretty much the one who watches our videos, so I just have to apologize to me. Anyway, let's unfold more of the world. So this is mostly more forest. In fact, now that I think about it, this is one of the corners of the world, pretty much. So there's several points in this world where we will see these big circles, which are like the ones that are at the end of levels. Those are just fights against massive amounts of enemies. They're all optional, and honestly, a lot of them are not worth doing. If you're good at this game, you will easily get to a full points selection, like all powers, without doing any of them. Nevertheless,
I kind of like games that do that.
Oh, me too. Well, it's typing, and I like typing, so I will never complain that this game gives you more typing practice. That is, after all, kind of the point. In fact, one thing I didn't notice until near the end of recording this is all recorded, by the way, is that there is an arena mode where you can basically just do this forever until you lose.
Or die of carpal tunnel.
That's right. Has anyone actually died of carpal tunnel? I'm not going to look that up because it's too depressing. Yeah, it's funny, it does seem like that's the kind of problem that you can solve just by having a slightly better wrist rest. And so it's sad to think that so many people got it when it's so easily avoided. Whatever.
Well, there's a number of contributing factors.
I guess so.
I actually briefly got carpal tunnel during my temping days.
Oh, that's a shame. Well, at least we know more about it now.
True.
Anyway, this one is fairly simple, although it does launch a lot of stuff at you. We're going to see a thing later on in this video where I fail at one of these, but I figured out the reason for that, which I'm going to go into when we see it.
Fire?
That's fire that I'm using. I don't have any other powers besides fire yet, so.
I was going to say that fire enhancement seems amazingly useful with the enemies that have longer words.
That's right. Yeah, because it gets rid of an entire one of them. There's another power later on that's even better for that, but that's to come. So anyway, that wasn't too difficult. Since you get to it earlier in the game, it's one of the easier ones. Anyway, I use these powers to do intensity, which will increase the amount of time we get from typing words. Very important to increase your score. There's a few things you can do early on in the game to make sure that your score gets high quicker, which is a very smart idea. It's kind of like using one of the experience perks in Fallout. Incredibly tangential reference, but yeah.
No, I know what you mean.
It's an interesting question whether those things are actually worth it. Whether the advantage you get from going up more levels is worth foregoing even a single perk.
That depends on the level cap you're playing with.
Yeah.
When you're playing something like New Vegas with all the expansions, where the level cap is 50, it's worth it, because without that kind of stuff, you won't hit level 50 until pretty much you've done everything.
Until you've gotten carpal tunnel syndrome from clicking on enemies too much.
Or in my case, both.
Yes. So we are already starting to run into the problem I mentioned earlier where you start running into enemies. Every time you come back from a dungeon, they put a few more in. And they respawn, but they don't. The respawn rate on these enemies is very small. In fact, near the end of the game, you'll notice these areas do start to feel a little empty. Which isn't terrible. I mean, The overworld is larger than I expected, but it's still a fairly small overworld, all things considered. And so you don't spend most of your time roaming around it. You spend most of your time in the levels. Probably as it should be.
True.
One thing I find interesting in this game is the way that the levels unfold. So it doesn't proceed in one direction, just showing you the whole thing unfolding. Instead, like, one area will unfold, and then another right next to it, and then one farther away. It's kind of an odd setup. In Okami, the whole thing is a cutscene, So, now that I think about it, though, that also does go from multiple angles. So it'll, like, if there's a river in the place, it'll travel down the riverbed, and then you see it, like, sprouting trees in one area. It's a lot more dramatic and cinematic in Okami, of course, because a lot more is happening.
Well, and the animations.
That's true. This game has pretty good animations for what it is, but it'd be very hard to challenge Okami, which is probably one of the most beautiful games ever designed.
Probably.
It always tickles me that Hideki Kamiya wrote that game. That game with a very complicated and actually quite good plot. When Hideki Kamiya is known for action games that don't emphasize plot at all. Like, he didn't even write Devil May Cry, which is a very basic plot. But he did write Okami, which is an RPG, at least in terms of its plot. It blows my mind. He's an amazing guy. That's why I did a video on him.
I wonder if that's why, because if he doesn't get to write many of his games, or he writes them, but he has to write them as, like, action games.
Well, I'll just say this,
Why he
a lot of people
might want to exercise his writing chops.
Yeah, definitely. It was his big chance to branch out, I think. I think that's why he made Okami what it is.
Anyway, you were saying?
A lot of people talked about loving the Kickstarters for Koji Igarashi doing Bloodstained Ritual of the Night, or why can't I remember his name? Capcom guy who did Mighty No. 9. Keiji Inafune.
Him.
But what I really want to see is I want to see Hideki Kamiya write another really complicated story-based game. Kickstart that, Internet. I mean, you can't, because he doesn't want to, but maybe someday he will. I don't know, I'm wondering if... Sorry, go ahead.
I was going to say a Kickstarter to force someone to write...
Raise so much money that it's literally an offer he can't refuse. That's my goal.
I was thinking more along the lines of, like, kidnap the original writer and force him to write a sequel.
Oh, there's been a Kickstarter
Misery style.
There's been a Kickstarter to kidnap someone, There must have been. Misery is actually a very good blueprint for people who want to get their favorite author to do what they want. The trouble is that it has to be like a snowstorm, and you have to save their lives, and what if they don't crash their car in the first place? It's not a model that's realistic for most people.
I think Misery is a good...
It changed the landscape, changed everything.
A good model for internet fandoms in general.
It is. No. Misery is 100% Stephen King showing how much he despises his fans.
Though they had been racked.
He's like, in my mind, you are a kind of pudgy, really creepy Midwestern woman. And it's funny, I don't think of, what is her name, Kathy Bates? No, that's not her.
Oh, yeah.
I cannot remember her name. I don't think of her as being that kind of person, but she did do an amazing acting job. Dina Natali, whose channel is called Cybercat, actually has a really good video on Misery.
Water blocked her path. Passage forbidden.
She has very good videos. They're called the Film Den.
I can't do this.
You ever watched
her, but I probably should.
She's good. I first found out about her because she did Silent Hill videos on what she called the Game Den. Kind of obvious, but
her path.
So now we are starting with the Drowning Halls, the second level, to get into much more like Zelda-ish territory. These, light up tiles without stepping on the same one twice. It's classic Zelda.
No.
I'm showing exactly the way you do not do this, which is you do not mess this up so badly that you have to step across every tile 3 times. But oh well.
Do you beat a villain by using the same item you collected in his area?
No, because you don't collect typing. Oh, and here I screw up so bad that I have to start again. There are no bosses in this game, right? The end of every level is literally just you,
that frightened her.
So this you have to go down the center to start with, because you cannot get to that from the end. Kind of a nasty trick, actually, if you go all the way down this shape. And then you're like, how do I get to that last one? The answer is, you should have done it first. Oh, well, that's how it goes. So now that I think about it, I actually didn't waste quite as much time as I could have. But I don't deserve any credit for that, because I've already done this before, so I should have known exactly how to do it. That's how it goes. Anyway, I really like the Drowning Halls. It's got a very interesting aesthetic. It's a fairly long level, too, and it's got some neat mechanics. Obviously, this is fairly simple. You know, no one would say that the tile-matching puzzles were their favorite part of Zelda. But I think they do a decent job of this. This game, it is very accessible, I would say. You can set the level of the words to your own thing. So, I've set it on British English, which is a little weird, but I just like to do it that way. I like having extra U's in words. It's like my own way of doing hard mode.
The more she learned, the less she knew.
But
Trapped.
you can eliminate the really complicated words, so if a kid wanted to play this, you could do it. And the relatively simple puzzles, I think, do a good job of working with that. Very few games I've played in recent times, where I could say that it works really well for adults and kids. So that's something to praise this game for, I think.
Mountains rose around her.
Those enemies, you might have noticed when I pressed spacebar that I could not fight them. It's exactly the same deal with the fire enemies.
A light shone ahead.
The
A
Burning
light
Hollow,
power.
I think that's what it was called. So we have to find this special power-up in order to fight them. This one, it's a little more tense, though, because you're in a straight-shot tunnel and they're chasing you. You have to run away from them. That's something that's going to be replicated in the following 2 dungeons. There's always a chase. This game actually has a nice sense of structure. The levels, they do, even though they are fairly unique, they do have a specific structure that's set up, where you start off not having the power, you get chased by some enemies, you find the power, and then you start using it. It's fairly typical Metroidvania stuff. So this power enables us to cross those ice flows that we saw earlier, just freezes them right in place. It does, however, turn them into ice, which makes them a little tricky to move on.
Yeah, because it makes them, slippery.
Now, the game expects you to move orthogonally to it, which makes this harder, but you can trick it a little bit by moving WASD, which means you just move straight north and south, east and west, which makes some of this a little easier. For instance, crossing this straight left would make it really easy. You wouldn't have to worry about navigating this labyrinth.
This is actually reminding me a bit of, the ice in Pokemon Gold and Silver.
Yeah, that is it's somewhat reminiscent. God, you're just reminding me of how annoying Ice Path was. I hate Ice Path.
Oh yeah, I kind of like the concept of that kind of puzzle, but the execution was pretty damn annoying.
The only ice thing that I like in Pokemon Gold and Silver was Wallace. If that was his name. I think it was. He was a great gym leader, because he's a crotchety old man. There aren't enough crotchety old men that you fight in gaming.
The river need not run so fast, and she need not be carried.
That's a lot of need nots.
Cryophobia. I wonder if that's a thing.
I can see that. Ice has a very strange sensation in your skin, you know? I imagine there's a fear of freezing. Like to death.
Well, someone with traumatic incidents, falling through, what is it? Falling...
Ice?
Falling through the ice on, a frozen lake.
Oh, that would be terrifying.
Traumatic experience.
Although anyone I can imagine doing that, I kind of imagine a lot of them wouldn't make it.
Well, you can survive that, absolutely.
I guess if they get you quickly. Anyway, with the introduction of ice as a power, we're starting to get introduced to a part of this game that is more difficult than you might imagine, which is having to switch between powers on the fly.
Oh.
Not such of a big deal now, since we're just doing puzzles with it, although they are very careful to show you that you will use fire and ice in the puzzles very quickly. Immediately after you get ice, you're starting to use both. And here they show it again. In combat, it's a much bigger deal.
I was actually not aware that you were, I didn't actually realize that you were having to actively switch between powers until you...
And you can see on the bottom, the way I switch between them is by typing, like everything else in this game. So one tricky thing is that when you're trying to type out a word, it might actually contain one of the words that your powers are. So you just change powers without noticing. That can happen. Another thing is, the powers have different effects. So when some enemies have to have a certain power used on them, that means you need to use that on them. So you need to consider which of the elemental enemies you should defeat first. So for instance, in this case, we have both fire and ice enemies at the same time. The good idea is to use the ice enemies first, because ice will stop an enemy in its tracks. Then, once they're stopped, and you don't worry about them for a while, you can take care of the fire enemies. If you're fast enough, it can work the other way too, since if you get fire enemies quickly, you'll have less words to deal with on them. But,
well, does the burning effect work on fire enemies? I should have been paying better attention here.
Yes, oh, absolutely. The effects work on all enemies. It's just that with certain enemies, you have to use that elemental power on them. They're not immune to the effects of the power. So I'm just showing here the gallery. I did sort of give the game away in the last episode, and I'm just going to flat out say it here. All of these levels are symbolic of something. They're symbolic of moments in the narrator's life. And this gallery thing you might have noticed, it shows a building and a bunch of people throwing hats outside it. I'm sure you can figure out what that is a reference to.
Oh, graduation.
College, yep. The drowning halls, the reason they're called that is because she was so overwhelmed that she felt like she was drowning in work. Kind of. That's the impression I get from it. I mean, this game's not terribly subtle. I think I have a pretty good grasp on what it's talking about. But that's how I interpret it anyway. It's kind of interesting that the style of this is very old-fashioned and Greek. So it's sort of like referencing the era of tradition that a lot of universities have. The first two levels, the Burning Hollow and the Forest, represented her childhood. That's why in one of the ones we saw, she found a fox. And that, I believe, is in fact the reason why she's riding on a fox right now.
What did the fire symbolize?
I have no idea. This isn't exactly like American McGee's Alice. It's not like her house burned down or anything. I just think fire symbolized the fact that she associates childhood with fire, maybe? I don't know. It's hard to imagine. I mean, fire, very passionate as an element. Well, the one thing I happen to know, I, for instance, am an Aries. Aries is a fire sign, and it's also associated with spring. So, Aries is the first sign in the zodiac. It represents the coming of the new year. So, in some sense, fire is seen as the start of something. Kind of.
Is that?
I also think fire is just good as an introductory element for games. So that was just a design consideration.
Are zodiac signs an intentional part of this game's symbolism?
No, they are not. In fact, I don't even think there is a zodiac sign that's a fox. Vulpix. It's the 13th sign. I actually really like Vulpix, but, Now I'm just wondering if anyone has tried to make a version of the zodiac signs with Pokemon.
Vulpix is one of the few Pokemon that incorporates Latin into its name.
That's true. In fact, its name just means fox, which is a little disappointing. Until you start learning Japanese Pokemon names and you realize that a lot of them are boring. Like Jolteon, who is literally called Thunder.
Which led me, I remember... Sorry to go off on a tangent.
Oh, don't worry about it. I'm dawdling anyway. I got lost.
When playing Fallout New Vegas, I kept thinking of the villain Vulpes and Kulta as Vulpix and Kulta.
Yeah, no kidding.
So much had happened.
So this is another one of those little tile puzzles. In this one, you again have to be careful because you can only approach, I believe, the middle left and middle right ones from a certain angle that you can't get the others from.
Interesting.
Yeah, and I'm pretty sure I've already ruined this for myself. I might not have. There's only a few ways you can move off from this introductory area. And in general, I believe the way it works is that you either go down the middle or you go to the left or right of it. Either one of those can get you towards one.
You think you could just wear an ice cape?
Would that help? Would that keep you from slipping at all? Also, how would you put ice skates on a fox? And I don't mean that rhetorically. I want to know how you can do it.
Maybe not an ice skate. Maybe like crampons or something like that.
Little fox snowshoes? Actually, snowshoes wouldn't do a thing for ice. I don't know what I'm thinking of.
No, I'm thinking of like climbing.
Oh, cleats.
The climbing spikes that you wear in your boots. Yeah.
Yeah. But if you could have one of those, then you could have lots of things in this game, and you're supposed to solve all your problems in this game by typing.
True.
It's kind of like Yu-Gi-Oh!, where all the problems in the world have to be solved with trading cards. Have you seen the episode of Yu-Gi-Oh! Where there's a fight going on, and Seto Kaiba literally hits someone's hand with a trading card to knock a gun out of their hand or something? It's absurd. Anyway, so we opened one of those doors in a secret room. Oh, sorry, it's not really secret. You have to go to it no matter what. But we opened the doors in one of those rooms with the little question mark thing. The second one has to be opened by a simple number puzzle. Pretty basic. You have to open both doors because you can see there's a line of red tiles in the middle. Touching any of those will undo all your work. So you can't really cross the middle of the room. It's a kind of interesting approach to making you have to go through the other two. I'm not sure entirely what I think of it, because it does seem a little bit brute force. It's literally saying you have to enter this room two different ways. I don't know. I suppose I'm neutral about it. Anyway, we are approaching the end of this level. There's going to be a few more enemies, but really no more major puzzles.
I mean, I've seen worse puzzles in games.
Absolutely. That's kind of damning with faint praise, but whatever.
Well, yeah. But...
So I almost ran into that guy. There's two different ways you can enter this room, but it's really kind of meaningless. They both lead to the same area. I guess it's just going to the bottom, you're more likely to discover this bonus chest. Oh, another nice thing. Right at the end, this game actually has something of an adaptive soundtrack. They start adding these choral voices,
One final
which are pretty cool.
lay ahead of her.
I actually really like them. They remind me of the soundtrack to Metroid Prime 3. Very specific there, but you know. I think a lot about video game soundtracks. So I tend to wander around these open areas at the end, but you really don't have to. There's never any secrets to find in these areas. They just pan out to make it seem more epic. And of course they have to pan out eventually just to show you all the enemies that are going to come on screen. So they kind of get that out of the way quickly. That phenomenon of having a camera that dynamically zooms out and in when, you know, something special needs to happen is something I've noticed a lot in both 2D and 3D indie games recently. So like Axiom Verge, for instance, like most Metroidvanias, has a fixed camera angle and level of zoom. But when you go up against bosses, the view will zoom out and the screen suddenly gets a lot more detailed. Matthew Matos has explained that as one of the benefits that you have of a game that starts off simple, is that you can ramp up the processing power when you have to.
I kind of wish, actually, I'm trying to remember if, Salt and Sanctuary does. I don't think it does. And I kind of wish it would.
All things considered, Salt and Sanctuary is actually kind of simplistic from a purely, coding angle.
I guess.
I don't think it really strains itself that much. It should be a simple game to play. I mean, obviously there's a trade-off, you know? You want to do interesting things, but at the same time, some games are made for even simple computers to play. I appreciate that. I have a computer that's not meant for gaming, so... I wouldn't want something like Salt and Sanctuary to shock me with crazy stuff. The simpler, the better. It's just other games don't.
I worked so hard to get here. Now I feel like
yeah, so that's just sort of making completely blatant what I explained earlier. It's like this place is drowning me. Oh, drowning halls, I get it. Apparently, this girl did not have an easy time getting into college. And we'll see later, she also didn't have an easy time getting a job or, you know, fitting in. But that's how it goes. I mean, honestly, if this woman had a really easy life, there probably wouldn't be an entire game representing her life struggles.
Though great wisdom flowed from the springs, they had not been kind to her.
The simple life of an uncomplicated person. No one would watch
that. It's also a little bit subtler than something like Hellblade.
She had overcome.
Really?
She felt stronger.
Hellblade is less subtle than this? Man, I'm glad I didn't play it.
Oh, dude, you watch it. I mean, I actually did like that game. More in some parts than others, but yeah, it's not subtle.
Who made Hellblade: Senua's Sacrifice?
I don't know. It was an indie team.
Ah, I see. Was it an RPG, like classic Chrono Trigger style?
No. It was primarily a puzzle exploration game with hack and slash elements.
I love puzzle exploration. They don't always work together, but I mean, this game is a puzzle exploration game.
You might like it.
So we can't do anything with that. The one thing I don't like is hack and slash. Honestly, any game where you fight enemies by, like, clicking and nothing else, I don't tend to be a fan of. The reason I was really into this game is that all the combat is typing, which I'm much more into. So anyway, this is an interesting little side area. This is the edge of the world, and you can't go any farther than this. As soon as you get to it, all these flies show up. This is, I think, the only place in the game where a bunch of this type of enemy shows up outside of a combat ring. It's like an ambush, like they were waiting for you at the edge of the world. Kind of poetic, almost. One thing that's nice about games that are mechanics-driven, which I would say this one totally is, because the typing dictates everything, is that things will happen in the game that are just mechanics-based, but you can sort of write your own story around it. You know, games where the story is everything, there's really no way for you to put your own interpretation in. Anyway. I'm finishing upgrading ice here, because ice is very useful. In general, I try to upgrade the elemental powers fully as soon as I can. I recommend that as a strategy. So, Greg, have you noticed something about the treasure chests? The words that show up on them?
I'm noticing, well, I was noticing prestige and dividend. I don't know what Toy Store has to do with.
They're all stuff that's kind of related to, like, treasure or things like that.
Uh-huh.
The prestige part, you know, because it's like a prize.
Dividend,
I get some of them are like banking terms. And then Toy Store, because it's like a bonus, like a prize. It's not very strict themes that are used in this. But there's definitely a thematic resemblance to it. You've noticed that all of the things in the ice flows are ice-related words.
I did notice that.
They like to use the word boreal a lot. That's a reference to the North Wind, which was called Boreas in ancient Greece.
Yep.
All of the winds had names. One of the most famous...
the Boreal Valley.
Oh, yeah, right. I forgot. They used that in Dark Souls. There's almost nothing in classic mythology that's not used by Dark Souls.
True enough.
It's kind of funny, really, because the primary inspiration for it was Middle Ages, but a lot of the references are archaic.
Yeah.
Funny. Then again, that's not entirely off. I mean, the Middle Ages was obsessed with the ancient world.
True.
You know, it's funny, but the thing about the Middle Ages, and I've read this in a lot of books, is that they didn't see a break between the past and their own time. So that's one of the reasons they portrayed, like, Trojans and people like that wearing Middle Ages clothes. Because it didn't occur to them that people would wear anything different. They figured, we're the direct descendants of these people, they probably live just like us.
Uh-huh.
That also explains why, for instance, Shakespeare has a number of anachronisms in his story. Unless he was just being lazy. Like, have you ever heard of the anachronism that in Julius Caesar, Brutus is reading a book?
Oh, yeah.
Like a modern codex form of book with pages and everything, instead of a scroll, which is the only form of book the Romans would have known.
Bell as well.
Yeah, there's a church bell. That's the hilarious part of it. They don't call it a church bell, but the only way it would have made sense is if it was a church bell, and the Romans did not have bells.
Or churches.
Well, debatable. You could say temples or churches.
True.
And one thing a lot of people don't realize is, even though the humanists of the Renaissance associated pagan stuff with irreligiosity, many Romans were in fact very religious. It's just they worship, you know...
Yeah, their own...
Juno and Minerva and Jupiter. In fact, not a lot of people know this, Julius Caesar was the high priest of Jupiter. That's one reason he was so rich. He was what was called Pontifex Maximus, which literally means great bridge. He was the bridge between the gods and humanity.
I had not thought of Pontifex that way.
That's actually the reason we call the Pope a pontiff. I don't know if you've heard that before. It's exactly the same thing.
I'd heard the term pontiff, I just didn't know it meant bridge.
It's not because the Pope pontificates, although the Pope has always done that. It's actually the reverse. Pontificate means you're talking like the Pope.
I knew that, but I didn't know that it had anything to do with bridges.
Now I'm wondering if pontoon, like a pontoon bridge, has anything to do with that. But I think a pontoon is just like an inflatable thing, right? It's not the name of the bridge, it's what goes under the bridge.
Yeah.
By the Red Hot Chili Peppers. Anyway. I'm going off on a huge tangent. So here we have discovered the second optional area. I did not know what this was at first. When I first discovered it, which was actually rather late in the game, one reason was I hadn't yet discovered that some of the areas were optional. I was still going on the assumption at this point that all the areas were required.
Were mandatory?
Mm-hmm. So like the woods, I figured, well, the woods are just the second level, right? But it should have occurred to me even back then that the woods didn't have any stuff in them, no upgrade. So why would I have needed to go in?
Frigid mountains climb towards the skies.
I like,
As she approached the frozen peaks,
I kind of do like the idea of,
she felt sadness come off them in waves.
what's...
Like mist rolling off
what
a
am I
sheet
trying-
of ice.
Non-linearity?
Well, not just non-linearity, optional areas that you don't realize are optional when you walk into them.
Well, it's always interesting to be surprised by a game. I definitely agree with that. You know, being surprised by a game is something... It is hard for games to do that anymore. Joseph Anderson, for instance, when he was reviewing Hollow Knight, which is just an amazing game, he talked about how he got tricked into going in an area without a map and getting stuck there because he saved it at one of the benches. And how it was one of the best experiences he'd had in a game in a long time because it was actually something that he wasn't prepared for and he had to deal with it. That gives you more of a sense of exploration than just wandering around. When you know your wandering actually has to go somewhere. It gives you a sense of purpose.
Mm-hmm.
Metroidvanias have always had a lot of trouble with that. Finding a way to make you think that you're making progress. Because some of them really, a lot of the areas you go in, a lot of the directions, just don't have much of a point.
True.
Speaking of no point, soon we're going to waste like the next 5 minutes in me trying to beat this. I mentioned at the beginning of this video that I do not win at this. I believe I try it twice. So now let me explain the reason. This is a very, very difficult one of these rings. And more importantly, I have this game on adaptive difficulty. What that means is the difficulty increases every time I successfully make it through an encounter.
Oh.
You can see the screen is just absolutely full of crap happening right now.
I think you told me that, actually.
Oh, did I? Well, I'll go over it again anyway, just, you know, for the sake of people who came in late. You know, some people might just be like, oh, he's all zoomed in on the first video. I'm going to skip to the second one. I'm presuming these people are going to watch the second one, which is silly, but anyway. So, adaptive difficulty. Some games do it differently than others. In some games, adaptive difficulty just means there are preset difficulty scales, and you switch between them when you do well or badly. This game, I believe, has it a little differently. Instead, the difficulty literally does increase every time you win, and therefore it can go above the preset difficulty levels. Later on, we will see I set the game manually to insane difficulty, which is the highest level out of, like, 6, and it is not this hard. In fact, it is not remotely this hard. So, I realize this sounds like me bragging while I'm losing, which is stupid, but I believe that I was so good at this game that I literally broke it and cranked it up way past insane. Like, you know how in The Princess Bride, when, like, Count Rugen has strapped the man in black into that torture device, and it takes away years of his life, and then later on the prince comes along and he sets it to 50? That's what I did to myself with this. It's weird, like, even though it's on insane adaptive difficulty, none of the regular parts of the game are even remotely this hard. Like, this is so hard that I am pretty sure it is impossible for almost anyone. Maybe someone who is a professional typist who has a 100 words per minute capability. I am not at that level. But anyway, for the normal person playing this game, that is simply not a winnable fight. And this is the point when I think either people would lose a lot, which would bring down the adaptive difficulty, or they would just set it to manual.
Oh.
So here's me opening up the second optional dungeon, which is called the Ice Mausoleum. Yeah, speaking of classical references, Mausoleum is actually one. It's named after a king. Have you ever heard of him? King Mausolus?
I don't think I have.
Yeah. It was just a big fancy tomb made for him. And it eventually became a name for a big fancy tomb.
Fair enough.
That's how it goes.
I didn't know that it was named for a specific person.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Unlike museum. Same kind of construction, but it's named for 9 people.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, they're not people. 9 goddesses. So for some reason, I don't know why I tried this again. It should have occurred to me last time that there were literally 20 insects on screen that I hadn't typed.
Yeah.
Anyway, it is kind of funny in this game, actually. What?
I was going to say, that is pretty brutal, God.
It's kind of funny in this game that these optional circle areas are so much harder than the rest of it. Even on full adaptive difficulty, I've never run across something like this in one of the normal levels. Whereas, even cranking the difficulty a little bit down, like setting it on manual and just harder, it's not this bad in the levels. What I mean to say is setting one of these circles on hard, or even like medium, it's still harder than the levels at maximum.
Which is weird.
It suggests that this really is meant to be optional, but like maybe you don't do this until the very end of the game. So I get closer here, but it really is just too much for me.
Yeah.
One thing I don't like is this game indulges in that stupid thing where when every time you die it gives you a smarmy little thing like, that doesn't work. Or, let's try that again. And stupidly, I do try again. Maybe I was just piqued by the game. I figured that if I was using ice, maybe I'd fare a little better. We'll actually see a little later I get an ability that could have made this possible. I'm not going to promise anything, because I don't do it at this level again. I mean, really, you can only waste so much time in a Let's Play. But that power, which we will see in the next video, is extremely useful. But right now I just have fire and ice, which isn't hugely helpful. The ice is the most helpful because I can stop enemies, which means I can at least buy myself some time to type in some of these words, some of which I really believe are not words. Like, have you ever heard of the word idem?
I have not, no.
I have a fairly good grasp of word roots, like what words could mean. I have no idea what idem would mean, if it is indeed a word.
Yeah.
One thing I like doing later on in this game, though, was like taking words on the same enemy or from different enemies and like associating them with each other. So like sometimes that works to create a little pun. You can make a little short story out of this stuff. It's kind of like those little refrigerator magnets that people used to put up. What was that called? It's like magnet poetry or something. I forget what the exact name is.
But I know what you're talking about, yeah.
Anyway, that was the final straw. You can see from the video timing that, like, I'm not going to do this again. Instead, we are just going to go over to the Ice Mausoleum. But unfortunately, I wasted so much time that we cannot do it in this video. It's a bit choppy how I did this. So the first video contained the first mandatory and first optional dungeon. The second had only one dungeon, the Drowning Halls. From here on, we are going to have the second optional and third mandatory, then the fourth... then the third optional and fourth mandatory. Oh god, I am mixing myself up completely. Anyway, we'll see.
You're mixing me up a little bit, but...
I just need to stop trying to mention it. It'll happen. There's no need for me to explain things that are going to happen right now. Anyway, we will enter the Ice Mausoleum next time. Thank you everyone for watching, and I hope you have a good evening.
Good night, everybody.